Hello friends, welcome to my Fellowship Dungeon Guide series where I cover everything you'll need to know for a dungeon from priority kicks to boss mechanics. One thing to note is in Fellowship, enemies gain additional abilities starting from the Adept Leagues, which we will be sure to cover. Before we get started, I just wanted to shout out Fellow's Guide, which is an awesome community built tool dedicated to Fellowship where you can craft builds, plan talents, and much more. Check out the link in the description below. And now let's look at today's adventure, Sailor's Abyss. First thing to cover are the pathing options. Sailor's Abyss is a circular map that's pretty linear. The only real choice you'll have to worry about making is going right or left at the start of the dungeon, but it doesn't really matter because the enemy types and distribution will be pretty similar regardless of the path you choose. Now let's cover the more notable mobs in the dungeon and what to look out for. The first mobs you'll likely encounter are the Hollowed Corsairs. These mobs are pretty beefy, but overall they don't really have any mechanics to worry about other than melee attacks starting out. However, once you reach the Adept League or higher, these mobs gain access to a nasty debuff called Wailing Strike, which applies a stacking bleed effect in a cone, and this conal effect will be targeted at the tank. Because it's always targeted at the tank, everyone will just have to be aware of the tank's positioning and just know that the tank will likely have to run away because once these bleed stacks start to get too high, the heals become quite impossible to keep up with. The next mob you'll likely encounter are Water Elementals. This mob has an interruptible cast called Hydrobolt, which deals a good chunk of damage to a target. As of the beta, it seemed like Hydrobolt might have been bugged in the way that if everyone stacks in melee, the Water Elementals would stop casting Hydrobolt. I'm not sure if that's going to be in the early access. I'm just calling it out here because it was something that was present previously. Just unsure if it was an actual mechanic or not. That being said, these mobs do have a high priority ability to interrupt, and that is called Healing Waters. This will just heal a target a pretty sizable amount, so you definitely want to make sure that this ability is being kept in check. Next up are the Vengeful Shades. This mob will normally just auto attack its target, but they do have a cast called Curse of Drowning, which will apply a dispellable dot on a target. This dot can be pretty nasty, so healers will just have to be ready with that dispel button. Even though Curse of Drowning can't be interrupted in the normal way of using kicks, you can still, however, stop it using crowd control abilities like stuns, knockbacks, or stuff like that. Tormented Spectres are often seen alongside Vengeful Shades. These Spectres will primarily melee their targets, however they do have a single casted ability to watch out for called Anguish Unleashed. This ability will target a player and deal a large amount of damage to them. This damage then seems to chain to nearby players, and that means that the damage output can get pretty scary. Kicking these Spectres is probably one of the highest priority kicks in all of Sailor's Abyss. The final mob to watch out for are the Deep-Bound Magi. There are only a few of these mobs, but they have a couple casted abilities. First is Necrotic Bolt, which just deals some magic damage to a target. Normally, this ability isn't a major concern and you can skip it. The ability you do need to watch out for though is called Shadow Eruption, which will deal damage to the whole party and apply a nasty debuff, which increases magic damage taken by players. This combined with Necrotic Bolt or their adept mechanic called Harrowing Solitude can be pretty scary. Harrowing Solitude will apply a debuff on a player where that player will have a circle on them. Once this debuff expires, that player will take a large amount of magic damage that needs to be distributed between players by stacking in the circle. Moving on to the boss of Sailor's Abyss, we have Synthara. The first thing to know about this fight is that it takes place on a wrecked ship, and on this ship there is a flag mast which will be very important for multiple reasons, and we'll cover those shortly. Synthara's first notable ability is Binding Strike. This will always create a tether between the tank and another player, and the farther away the players are from each other, the more damage that this tether is going to do to each of those players. So if you see that this tether is applied to you, you really need to stack up as quickly as possible. In fact, I'd recommend most of this fight be done while playing around in melee to reduce the damage going out from Binding Strike. The next ability is Undertow. Synthara will target a single player and apply a damage over time effect on them. This ability can be dispelled, upon which a puddle is going to be dropped on the ground that slows and deals damage to any player stepping inside of that puddle. It's very important to drop these puddles on the edge of the room and completely away from the flag mast. So healers, don't be dispelling this effect immediately. Let your players actually position themselves into a good spot before dropping off those puddles. The next ability is Deafening Screech. This deals party-wide damage, and anyone who's channeling an ability during this screech is going to be interrupted and silenced for a few seconds. So don't go casting any abilities while this deafening screech is being casted. One trick with this ability, however, is that you can actually avoid the damage if you line of sight behind the flag mast. This is going to become increasingly more important the higher your key level goes. Once Synthara reaches 50% HP, she will fly into the air. At this point, all players need to move to the mast and interact with it by left clicking. This will chain you to the mast. After a brief delay, Synthara will begin channeling her siren song, attempting to force players to jump to their deaths. After her song ends, Synthara returns to the ship and applies a nasty debuff to all players that simply deals ticking damage for the remainder of the fight. This damage is unavoidable and can really ramp up the pressure on healers. Once you reach a depth, Synthara gains access to one additional ability called Necrotic Wave. This ability will target a player in a line. After a moment, a wave of energy is fired at that player, dealing damage to and knocking back any players in the indicated space. This damage can be avoided by line of sighting the boss behind the mast. Overall, this fight is pretty simple. You want to keep the mast area clear of any undertow puddles so you can utilize the mast for both line of sight purposes as well as when you're chaining yourself to the pole. Stack up in melee as much as possible to reduce the damage of Binding Strike. And finally, at 50%, once again, you want to chain yourself to the pole in order to avoid taking a plunge. And that wraps up this guide on Sailor's Abyss. Let me know in the comments if you feel anything was missed. But this was GooberTroy, thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.